Okay, so now it's time to start on the grand journey, which is Understanding Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is a truly, truly brilliant piece of work, very complex, sometimes a little bit frustrating, but something that really, if you put the time in, is going to be more rewarding than pretty much anything else. Emerson, for those of you who don't know, was one of the most famous intellectuals of the 19th century anywhere in the world. He was American, of course. He's most famous for this piece, Nature, Self-Reliance, The American Scholar, including a bunch of lesser-known works such as Circles. He's definitely somebody who has lived a very compelling life, is pretty much the founder of the school of thought known as transcendentalism, sort of the idea that you can achieve some sort of greater connection to the absolute via communion with nature, and that can give you the opportunity to transcend sort of the material world into a greater awareness. Influenced Thoreau, who actually spent time on his land at Walden Pond, and Whitman, for whom he sort of wrote a recommendation letter that Whitman then, published and promoted without Emerson's permission. Emerson, had a difficult life. He came from a long line of preachers. His father died when he was very young. He was married, and after he'd been married for under 2 years, his wife died of tuberculosis that caused sort of a crisis of faith for him and caused him to sort of leave behind his congregation to sort of go on the life of being, sort of a public intellectual. But all of that is sort of, beside the point when considering this brilliant piece of work that we have before us, Nature, this sort of essay that we have. It's a grand document. It sort of is an example of Emerson's aphoristic style, the fact that he built a lot of his wisdom around, he's just basically sort of, he's a quote machine. He just constantly is churning out brilliant little pieces of wisdom. He'd be great working in a fortune cookie factory, for example. The structure of this work, it's broken into a lot of different pieces. The main thing is he's going to discuss nature, obviously, and what exactly that means. The structure here is he has the introduction in the first chapter, Nature, and then he goes into the uses of nature: commodity, beauty, language, and discipline. And these are the things that we sort of gather from nature. And then he sort of wraps it up by talking about idealism, which is the, sort of deals with the question of whether, the material world is actually real, spirit and the relationship to God, and also prospects or ideas of improvements or possibilities for the future. And that this is the basic layout of this piece of work. So as we go through this, we're just pretty much just going to look for great quotes and ideas that Emerson brings up, and then sort of do our best to unpack these grand ideas, because he's definitely not shy from putting out giant philosophical concepts and then sort of just expecting us to, work our way through. A big thing with Emerson is just sort of taking your time and allowing yourself to bask in his genius, because he definitely is a brilliant individual, and just via going through nature, it will become blatantly obvious to us, just how many thoughts he had, and not just how many thoughts he had, but how exactly those thoughts are going to be beneficial to us. So, he opens up Nature with a section simply called Introduction, in which he posits, he says, undoubtedly we have no questions to ask which are unanswerable, which is quite the assertion to make right out of the gate. Basically saying that any issue in the world is something that we can have an answer to. Many people would put this sort of just in terms of science, but he takes it a little bit further, and he says, every man's condition is a solution in hieroglyphic to those inquiries he would put. He acts at his life before he apprehends it as truth. So in this way, he's not just saying that we can answer all these questions relatively simplistically, but that living our lives in and of itself that our life is the answer to any questions we can put. So you can see already he's coming out throwing fastballs. The next thing that he needs to do after that is define his terms. What is nature? Usually we usually consider nature in this sort of small sense, what Emerson refers to as the common usage. It's the idea of nature is something that's out there. Nature is trees. Nature is animals. Nature is the part of the world that is not denigrated by human activity and human intervention. That this is something that's separate from us, something that's out there in the world and doesn't include human interaction. That's sort of what you can consider lowercase n nature, that idea of something separate. So there's that idea of nature, which is a valid definition. Also important is the idea of capital N nature, this idea of nature as something grand, something larger, something bigger, and that this concept of nature is something that includes humanity and that literally, could equate to the idea of the absolute, or the idea of, God and inclusiveness with the universe, that the universe and existence itself, that is fundamentally nature. So that's a much larger definition of nature. And I think it's interesting to go as you walk your way through this essay to actually sort of consider both of these definitions. Nature as something that's outside of us, but then nature also as something that in all ways includes us. And that brings us to chapter 1, of course, called Nature. In this chapter, he starts to sort of posit our relationship fundamentally to what nature is exactly. He says, if the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how men would believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God which had been shown. And later on, he talks specifically, it says, few adult persons can see nature. Most persons do not see the sun. In this, he's talking about the fact that we just take nature for granted. Like we walk outside, we walk through our houses, we walk in the forest, we drive down the street in our car. Obviously, Emerson wasn't talking about that. But in our regard, we do all of these things and we just sort of take it for granted. And, we can look up at the sky and we can see the sun and just sort of be like, okay, whatever, it's the sun, who cares? Okay, but think, if the sun were something that only showed up, once every 100 years, how amazed everyone would be at the privilege of having seen the sight. And Emerson's trying to put forth that idea here that, we shouldn't necessarily take it for granted. Most persons do not see the sun. That if we go out, we really want to, keep our eyes open and be aware of this beauty that's in the miracle of reality in nature that's sort of infused in every minute of every day. He also talks about, sort of surveying the landscape. Okay, he says, if you look out at the landscape, it says, Miller owns this field, Locke that, and Manning the woodland beyond, but none of them owns the landscape. I think that that's a really kind of beautiful idea, because you can just be, driving down the street and you see Jack in the Box over there and McDonald's over there and Home Depot over there and somebody's house over there and, something else over there and an open field over there and say, oh, this belongs to that person, this belongs. But nobody owns the landscape itself, that all of us are privy and capable of enjoying and taking advantage of this sort of like wondrous thing that presents itself before us at all times, and that fundamentally nature is a democratic element that belongs to everyone. You can see the romance in that idea. He says, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. This is really getting into that idea that if you make yourself part of nature, if you go out in the world and just sort of like stand there and survey everything that's going on around you, you will be able to sort of recognize and appreciate this massive beauty. That idea of becoming the transparent eyeball. It sounds weird, but in sort of a beautiful sense, if you really become one with the nature that's around you, you are this transparent eyeball. You're just sort of like the universe is pummeling you with its data and its beauty and its magnificence, and you're just sort of there to experience it. So he closes this first chapter, chapter 1, by saying, "Nature always wears the color of the spirit. To a man laboring under calamity, the heat of his own fire hath sadness to it." In this, he's getting at that idea that nature is the truest reflection of reality as it is, and that it also is a reflection of mankind or womankind as that attitude is projected. That basically, if you go out into the world and you have a bad attitude, the universe will seem to have a bad attitude right back at you. But if you go out into the world and you see, and you have a good attitude, the universe will seem to reward you with a good attitude. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. Like he says, to a man laboring under calamity, the heat of his own fire hath sadness to it. So if somebody's in a bad state of mind, even the most glorious thing, the most life-giving thing can seem sad and negative. And I think that that's an important piece of advice. On to chapter 2. Chapter 2, commodity. This is the beginning of the section in which Emerson sort of systematically goes through the different uses of nature. Commodity, beauty, language, and discipline. And that via these 4 uses of nature, we sort of can appreciate and understand all that it does for us. Both the nature that's out there and unmolested by humankind, and the nature that is part of us. So this section, commodity, this is the most banal, least profound aspect and element that nature provides for us. Okay, as he says, it is the only use of nature which all men apprehend. Okay, because this is the idea of what nature can provide for us. Nature can provide wood for us. Nature can provide water for us. Nature can provide metal beneath the ground with which we can build things. Nature gives us dirt that we can put in a pile if we want and dig through. That nature gives us fruit, and nature gives us all of these various things, and that these products, commodities that nature gives us is something that all men can understand. The other aspects of nature, the other things that it gives us, are a little bit more difficult to understand, but this one, everybody gets this one. He says that we are sort of ridiculous if we don't appreciate it. He says, the misery of man appears like childish petulance when we explore the steady and prodigal provision that has been made for his support and delight on this green ball which floats him through the heavens. That basically, if we are acting petulant and ridiculous and ungrateful, we are just being completely absurd, when you actually look out and see everything, that's given to us. Right now, I am inside of a house that is built using the products of nature, and surely you are also inside of some place that was built using the products of nature, or you are watching this on something that was built using the products of nature. And that if we don't take time to appreciate that, we are sort of fundamentally screwing up, our recognition of what nature provides for us. He ends this commodity section. It's a very brief section because, like I said, it is kind of banal and easy to understand, with this really peculiar sentence. A man is fed, not that he may be fed, but that he may work. I've always found that to be a really kind of like problematic and strange thing to, end this section with, this idea that people are fed so that they can work, so that they can be part of the sort of aspect of reality that is, constantly producing, constantly out there, constantly thinking, constantly engaged in the world. So I'll sort of leave it up to you to consider. What do you think that means necessarily? A man is fed, not that he may be fed, but that he may work. You can sort of work your way through that idea and try to work to unpack it. So, chapter 3, beauty. Okay, this is where things really start to pick up steam in this essay, because he says that nature doesn't just provide for us objects, but it also provides for us fundamentally our understanding of beauty and what beauty is and how we achieve beauty and all of these things. That this is something that nature gives to us. Okay, it says, as the sky, the mountain, the tree, the animal give us a delight in and of themselves. Okay, and then he says the eye is the best of artists, and that nature is something that fundamentally, in and of itself, gives us our idea of beauty. He even goes so far as to say, there's no object so foul that intense light will not make it beautiful. Even the corpse hath its own beauty. And that basically, our idea of what is beautiful, our idea of what is, delightful, our idea of what is like pristine or rewarding or pleasing to the eye or pleasing to the experience, that all of these are things that are given to us by nature, things that we wouldn't have gotten somewhere else. He goes on to complexify this idea even further in really sort of trying to show us just how profound and amazing this particular beauty is. One thing I really, really love, he says, to the attentive eye, each moment of the year has its own beauty, and in the same field it beholds every hour a picture which was never seen before, and which shall never be seen again. Okay, think about that. It literally, like every minute, every hour, every day, every second, all of these things, you look out at the same landscape and it's not the same. That literally every time you open your eyes, you are seeing something as it has never been seen before, and that fundamentally it will never be seen again. Pretty crazy, right? Like even if you're outside, the clouds are in a little bit of different place. The light, coming through the sky, the sun's in a slightly different place. Things are a little bit different. Maybe one blade of grass has changed. And even if you're inside, that man-made nature, even there, the particles in the air, the aspects of the world, and most importantly, perhaps yourself in your own, mental position as you are viewing this thing that you are witnessing is something that is changing fundamentally. And there's something really beautiful about that. And it goes back to that idea that he talked about earlier in the essay, about how, most people do not see the sun. We see the sun, be like, okay, it's the same sun, but if you try to keep that idea, that childlike innocence, that idea that you're always seeing something new, that every time you look at the sun, you're seeing something profound, that you're seeing it for the first time, that sense of awe and beauty and astonishment can come roaring back. Okay, and along with this kind of recognition, this kind of awakening to the glories of the universe as they are provided, it says, in proportion to the energy of his thought and will, he takes up the world into himself. Okay, and the idea there is sort of akin to the concept that the answers you will get, and this is a great quote, the answers that you will get from literature depend on the questions that you ask. I think that that's a really fantastical literary quote, and here that sort of idea is very much about the notion that the answers you get from the universe, the beauty that you can see in the universe depend on what sort of questions you asked of the universe. And if you aren't really doing the work to ask the good question, how can you really expect to find the good answer? So he goes on to say, a little bit further along, he says, nothing, though, is quite beautiful alone. Nothing but is beautiful in the whole. A single object is only so far beautiful as it suggests this universal grace. That if you see things just as isolated objects, nothing can really quite be beautiful in isolation, but nothing can help but be beautiful if you see it as part of the whole. It's like that sort of idea where it's like nothing, if you shine a bright enough light on anything, anything can be beautiful. Even like the gross thing, something disgusting. If you just see it as itself, you're like, ugh, that's gross, but if you see it as part of this greater whole, this part of this fantastical wholeness that we have out here in the world, then it can be something that's truly beautiful. So in this section, he's definitely making the argument that nature, one of its gifts to us as people is, via an understanding of what is beautiful, and that via seeing and witnessing nature in all of its wholeness and all of its togetherness, we as human beings sort of achieve our notion of what exactly beauty is and what it can be. Chapter 4, Language. Okay, this is a pretty complicated section when you really get into it. So we're just going to sort of talk about some of the main ideas. Okay, one of the big ideas in this language section is the idea that fundamentally our language and the way that we talk about things and the methods that we use to talk about things, all of this product, all of this linguistics, all of these words, all of these notions of how to communicate are all things that derive fundamentally from nature. Okay. Early on in this section, he talks about how specific words derive from natural elements. But that part, is sometimes a little bit problematic linguistically. But some things he does say, do hold a lot of weight. As he says, an enraged man is a lion, a cunning man is a fox, a firm man is a rock, a learned man is a torch. Okay, and then he goes on to say, these are not the dreams of a few poets here and there, but man is an analogist and studies relations in all objects. That's a really fantastic idea. Man is an analogist. That basically we as human beings are constantly out there seeking to make connections, seeking to, find like, oh, this is like this, that we utilize metaphor. As Aristotle said, metaphor is a fine skill, that it is a skill that sort of denotes and distinguishes, a brilliant mind from one that is less brilliant, because metaphor is an understanding of connection. Okay, Emerson understood this fundamentally, but he is making the argument that that ability to connect, that ability to seek metaphor is something that is derived specifically from nature. Okay, he also even says, in like manner, the memorable words of history and the proverbs of nations consist usually of a natural fact selected as a picture or parable of a moral truth. And he gives a bunch of examples. A rolling stone gathers no moss. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Make hay whilst the sun shines. The last ounce broke the camel's back. Okay, all of these sort of idioms that we have in our speech are all things that you can see are derived directly from nature. Okay, so he's making this sort of complex argument that our way of communicating is something that always comes from nature. Then he does get into some really complicated ideas. One of my favorite complicated ideas he puts forth is this one. He says, have mountains and waves and skies no significance but what we consciously give them? That's a tough question. Have mountains and waves and skies no significance but what we consciously give them? Here he's starting to get into this idea of what you could call innatism. Okay, innatism is sort of the idea that things have fundamental properties within themselves, and that we as human beings then survey or observe this thing, this object, and then we sort of can witness that innate element within them. He's asking this issue there. Is that really true? Is there such thing as an innate element when there's a mountain out there? Does that mountain have meanings? In and of itself, or are those meanings just things that we give to it? So this gets into all sorts of really heavy-duty philosophy, okay, like Kantian ideas of the thing in itself. Can we really know the object in itself, okay, or are we always sort of condemned to seeing it through our own lens? All this sort of stuff. That's a lot of heady philosophical stuff that we don't necessarily have to deal with, but it is something that Emerson isn't shy to bring up here. Okay, so all of this type of stuff sort of comes back to some of these big ideas, and he sort of closes down this section by really getting into some big-time spiritual issues. He quotes George Fox, who was an English Quaker, as saying, "Every scripture is to be interpreted by the same spirit which gave it forth." And this is a huge sort of idea and how it relates to language, right? Because it's that sort of idea that to really understand any scripture, you have to be in the mindset of the person who initially wrote it, because that was the person who was comprehending nature's relationship to language purely in that moment. Man, that is some big stuff to deal with. And I don't blame you if you have trouble trying to wrap your mind around that, because it's a difficult one. If you wanted to get really theological about it, you could start asking the question of, is it possible to really get into the mindset of the the same spirit which gave it forth. In a biblical sense, are you really going to be able to get into the mindset that Moses was in, when he was writing Deuteronomy, if that's the interpretation you want to take? Is that something that's possible? Okay, that's another huge issue. Emerson doesn't necessarily answer that question for us, but it's just another example of how Emerson isn't afraid to throw out huge ideas, giant questions, massive considerations, and then sort of say, like, you have fun with that. Chapter 5, Discipline. Okay, so this is the last of the uses of nature that Emerson puts forth for us to chew on. In this discipline section, what he's really getting at here is the idea, not discipline that it's going to, tell us, get us in trouble, or that it's going to punish us or anything, but that basically nature, one of the gifts that it gives us are lessons. Okay, lessons, that kind of discipline, that it gives us, disciplines like, physiology, disciplines like biology, disciplines like physics, disciplines like humanism, these kinds of disciplines, these kinds of ways of understanding, ways of seeing the world. As he says, every property of matter is a school for the understanding. That this is another thing that nature gives us. Okay, so it has some really big ideas here. He says, our dealing with sensible objects is a constant exercise in the necessary lessons of difference, of likeness, of order, of being and seeming, of progressive arrangement, of ascent from particular to general, of combination to one end, of manifold forces. Okay, that might seem like a lot to wrap your head around, but really what he's saying is that every single day, our sort of experiencing things in the world is giving us lessons in terms of how to comprehend what's going on and how to distinguish between one thing over here, something else over here, this thing over here, that thing over here. He says, what tedious training day after day, year after year, never ending to form the common sense. That basically nature is constantly teaching us, okay? Not just commodity, not just beauty, not just language, but how the world works. Okay, that nature is constantly giving us lessons and instruction on the way that nature functions, the way that we should function within it, the ways that we are part of it, the ways that we can use it, the ways that, we can sort of try to figure things out, and that this is yet another thing that nature provides for us. He says this really great part. He says, the wise man shows his wisdom in separation, in gradation. His scale of creatures and of merits is as wide as nature. The foolish have no range in their scale, but suppose every man is as every other man. Okay, so he's basically saying that the wise person learns what could be called discernment. That this discernment is something where we learn the ability to judge and find gradation, find this stuff goes over here, that stuff goes over here, and our ability to sort and comprehend is something that nature necessarily is giving us. Okay, later on he goes in to say some other lessons that nature has provided. For example, nothing in nature is exhausted in its first use. In God, every end is converted into a new means. Thus, the use of commodity regarded by itself is mean and squalid. Okay, that basically this is the idea of an extended timeline, that we're constantly being given new stuff. Nothing in nature is exhausted in its first use. Okay, like you cut down the tree, with that tree you make a table. Then the table starts to go bad. You take that table, you can grind it up and, turn it into paper. And once that paper goes bad, then you can recycle it into new paper. And then when that paper goes bad, you can, burn it in a fire and turn it into, smoke and carbon that then will become part of the soil that will, you see where I'm going with this. It's very sort of Whitman-esque, and written before Whitman wrote Song of Myself. That sort of idea that everything in nature continually provides more opportunities. Okay, then he gets into a really sort of beautiful idea of what is a farm but a mute gospel. That this this sort of lesson, okay, that via looking out there at the landscape, that is a gospel in and of itself, which is a very, very beautiful idea. And he sort of ties that back to this idea of Xenophanes, who was a famed Greek philosopher. It says Xenophanes complained in old age that look where he would, all things hastened back to unity, and that if you could look out at the world, you could see this unity everywhere, and that the farm is in and of itself a mute gospel, that each particle is a microcosm and faithfully renders the likeness of the whole. That this, unity is bringing everything together, and that is sort of one of the disciplines that is sort of brought to us, and sort of is given to us in a fantastic way. Then, sort of in opposition to this, he does posit this idea that words are kind of a problem. Okay, like he'd uplifted language in an earlier section, saying that language was a good thing, that it was something that was derived from nature. But here he says, words are finite organs of the infinite mind. They cannot cover the dimensions of what is in truth. They break, chop, and impoverish it. And this gets back to the idea that language, like all language, is built around shortcoming. Okay, that if you have one word, that word is necessarily exclusive and exclusionary. Okay, that if you have a word table, and then there are certain things that you would consider table and other things that you wouldn't consider table, and that when you do that, you create duality, you create separation, you create a binary, and that this binary detracts from unity, and therefore language can sort of end up diminishing the truth as it is seen. But ultimately, in this discipline section, he comes to this idea that everything is ultimately one, and that via this oneness and the recognition of these lessons that are given to us by nature, we can see how it all comes together. He says, in the one thing he does rightly, he sees the likeness of all which is done rightly, and that's a lesson we can learn from nature. So, chapter 6. Okay, this is going a little bit further down the wormhole. Idealism. Okay, so this is where he starts taking it away from the uses of nature and starts just considering philosophical concepts regarding to the natural situation. It says relatively early on in this section, a noble doubt perpetually suggests itself whether this end be not the final cause of the universe, and whether nature outwardly exists. Oh man. Okay, here's where we get into this question of, okay, we've talked about all these uses of nature, but is nature actually real? Okay, is this a real thing? Is this something that is actually, are there physical things that are real in the world? Like, is this pen, I've got a pen here, is this thing real? Or is it just sort of a figment of my imagination? Am I a figment of my imagination? Or are you a figment of your imagination? Is everybody who you see part of your imagination? Is the chair you're sitting in a real thing? Is the computer that you're watching, is that real, or is it part of your, projection? His response to this is, he says, the frivolous make themselves merry with the ideal theory, ideal being the notion that it's all just ideas, as if its consequences were burlesque, as if it affected the stability of nature. It surely does not. God never jests with us. Okay, so his response to this question of whether it's real is more or less, who cares? Okay, his response, more or less, who cares? Because ultimately, it doesn't really matter whether it's real or not, because it seems real. Okay, it seems real, even if nature isn't really real, even if it is in the Eastern conception what they would call Maya, just an illusion. If it is just an illusion, it doesn't really make any difference, because it still seems real. A rock is still hard, water is still wet, whether it is actually real or not. And that's kind of the issue that he brings up. He does say the question of the absolute existence of nature still remains open. So he doesn't shut it down. He doesn't say that it's not worth thinking about. But he does sort of say that, there's no reason to just devote your whole life to freaking out about this problem, because it doesn't, really make that much of a difference. And then he gets to sort of bigger, more interesting questions about how to view the world. He says, the least change in our point of view gives the whole world a pictorial air. A man who seldom rides needs only to get into a coach and traverse his own town to turn the street into a puppet show. Okay, so like it's sort of in our situation, it might be better to go the other way. It's sort of like you probably experience, like you drive around in your car all the time and you never really see anything. But then if you walk in your neighborhood or if you ride a bike in your neighborhood, all of a sudden, all those things that you just sort of drove by sort of achieve like a new meaning. They sort of pop out of the landscape in a, more like freakish, puppet showish kind of fashion. And that he sort of is talking about how that perspective is something that can change. Okay, one of the other really interesting ideas he brings up in this section is a complicated one. It's after he sort of quotes this poetry and some drama, and then he says, it proceeds on the faith that a law determines all phenomena, which being known, the phenomena can be predicted. Okay, so I just want to touch on this real quick because it relates back to this sort of physical concept, this idea, idea called Laplace's demon. Okay, Laplace's demon. This is something Emerson doesn't talk about directly, but it relates to what he's talking about. It's the concept that if you know sort of the position and momentum and all of that of every atom in the universe, you would be able to know all of the past and therefore all of the future. Okay, like physicists and quantum mechanics say that this isn't possible, but it's sort of the philosophical concept, that you would, if you knew all of that, all the position and momentum, you would be able to predict all the future. That's Laplace's demon. Emerson here says it proceeds on the faith that a law determines all phenomena, which being known, the phenomena can be predicted. So you can see how he's sort of touching on that huge, grand idea, which is an interesting thing to consider. Okay, he says, it appears that motion, poetry, physical and intellectual science, and religion all tend to affect our convictions of the reality of the external world. Because as he's sort of saying, in many ways, all of these things make us question whether the world is real. He even says regarding religion, the things that are seen are temporal, the things that are unseen are eternal. And that's one thing that religion often puts forth. Like, think of it in Christianity. We are down here in the real world, which is temporal, it's ephemeral, dust into dust, all this vanity, these kind of ideas. And then fundamentally, then there's heaven, which is permanent and eternal and everlasting. Right? So there's this, relationship between these things, and that this is something that's sort of put forth and that he talks about in this section. Okay. Here's a beautiful thing, though. It says that we should sort of look at Christianity in kind of a different way. He says, it sees something more important in Christianity than the scandals of ecclesiastical history or the niceties of criticism, and very incurious concerning persons or miracles, and not at all disturbed by chasms of historical evidence. Okay, and then he's talking about nature. He says, it accepts from God the phenomenon as it finds it as the pure and awful form of religion in the world. That basically, don't look to, church history necessarily for an idea of what God is. To know what God is, open your eyes and then see around you and witness that God as it is everywhere. Chapter 7, Spirit. Okay. In this section, we go even further into big sort of huge ideas. Okay, where it says necessarily regarding the nature of God and all of this complexity. It says we can foresee God in the coarse and as it were distant phenomena of matter, but when we try to define and describe himself, both language and thought desert us, and we are as helpless as fools and savages. Okay, that basically, like, out there we can see God, we can consider God, we can try to witness that beauty, but that when we try to describe it, that's when we fail. That's when we fall short. That's when we are incapable of really getting in there. He raises 3 questions. He says, 3 problems are put by nature to the mind. What is matter? Okay, that's the idealism issue. Whence is it? Which means where does it come from? And where to? Where is it going? Okay, so these 3 questions. What is the world? Where did it come from? And where is it going? That these are the questions that we need to deal with. Okay? And then he argues that the supreme being does not build up nature around us, but puts it forth through us. Okay, and this is where he sort of starts to get into this. He's not just a materialist saying like, oh, nature is out there and we witness nature. He's saying that nature isn't necessarily something that's out there, that nature is something that was witnessed through us, that it goes through us, and that's how it's given its opportunity to shine. Okay, this is a transcendental idea that in a sense we can recognize the absolute by recognizing that the absolute works through us. Okay, so that's a pretty beautiful thing. Okay, one big last idea in this section, this relatively brief section that I think is really kind of beautiful and great. Okay, and this is a fantastic thing that is really, really good and helpful to sort of consider and debate and grapple with in life. It says, is not the landscape, every glimpse of which hath a grandeur, a face of him. Okay, is not the landscape, every glimpse of which hath a grandeur, a face of him. Okay, this is the idea that you look out at the world, you look out and you see the world, and anywhere that you look in the world, that is the face of God. Okay, the face of God is everywhere. Okay, it's not in books. Okay, necessarily, it's not something that's distant from us. It's not something that's absent. It's not something that we have trouble finding necessarily. That if really if we recognize it, we can just look out at the world, not just the pretty things, not just the waterfalls and the trees, but the buildings, the dumpsters, the road, the traffic jam. That is the face of God as well. And that's sort of how he closes down this section on spirit. And that brings us to the last section, chapter 8, prospects. Okay, this is where Emerson is sort of looking out at future improvements and possibilities, where maybe all of this inquiry is going to lead. He talks about a lot of interesting things in this section. Of course, like, as it's known, Emerson's essays move like vines. They wander around through a variety of things. He has in this section a poem by, the great writer George Herbert, if that's your preferred pronunciation of his name, in which there are many great ideas. More servants wait on man than he'll take notice of. Man is one world and hath another to attend him. Lots of great ideas that he infuses in this section. But one of the big things that he puts forth here is talking about mankind's fundamental shortcomings and inability or refusal to understand just how fortunate we are. Okay, as he says, a man is a god in ruins. Okay, that's a fantastic quote, just a great one. I told you, like, Emerson, he's just a quote machine. A man is a god in ruins. And that basically, like, we aren't recognizing just all that we have and all that's been given to us. Okay, it says, the reason why the world lacks unity and lies broken and in heaps is because man is disunited with himself. Okay, and this is something that we all need to take responsibility for. The reason why we look at the world and we're like, the world is like, it's suffering over here and it's disease over here and it's problems over here, and that we see all these things that are broken and we're unhappy with our lives, we're unhappy with our paychecks, we wish our boss were nicer to us, we wish our classes were easier, all this sort of stuff. But it's like this idea that the reason why it seems like the world lacks unity, is because we're not unified with ourselves. And that if we really become unified with ourselves, that's when we're going to, be able to wake up to the beauty and grandeur of nature that's been provided for us. It says, there are innocent men who worship God after the tradition of their fathers, but their sense of duty has not yet extended to the use of all their faculties. Okay, that just believing, in what your parents believe, that, worshiping, God or the universe or science or anything, just because that's what you've been told, that's not going to do it for you. That it's like you need to wake up and sort of smell the coffee and do it on your own. And only then, are you going to really be able to find true meaning and appreciation. It says, no man ever prayed heartily without learning something. That if you really, really pray, if you really wake up to it, that you're going to sort of that you're going to learn something, that you're going to see the beauty. It says, and this is a great line, the invariable mark of wisdom is to see the miraculous in the common. What is a day? What is a year? What is summer? What is woman? What is a child? What is sleep? To our blindness, these things seem unaffecting. That when we look at these things, we often are just like, oh, it's ordinary. Who cares? It's concrete. It's a building. It's a flower. But really, the invariable mark of wisdom is to see the miraculous in the common, that the miracle is everywhere. The miracle isn't just, the water being turned into wine. It's what happened before that and what happens after it that's just as miraculous. It's the water itself, which is the miracle. It's the wine itself, which is the miracle, and all of that. And that's sort of what Emerson is trying to get out there for us. Okay, so he closes up the last paragraph. He says, so shall we come to look at the world with new eyes. Okay, that after all of this, we can go out at the world and see it for what it really and truly is. He says, know then that the world exists for you, that it all comes down to you. All that Adam had, all that Caesar could, you have and can do. Adam called his house heaven and earth. Caesar called his house Rome. You perhaps call yours a cobbler's trade, a student, a person, a learner, a parent, an American, a citizen, a human being, whatever. But that all of this, the world exists for us. And he says, build, therefore, your own world. Go out into nature, see it, experience it, recognize the beauty that all of it is, because it truly is a fantastic and wondrous thing.